Bulky pivots have been around since Generation 2, starting with Baton Pass, the first switching move. U-turn was added in Generation 4, and now in Gen 9 we have Chilly Reception, Flip Turn, Parting Shot, Volt Switch, and Teleport. In addition to switching the user out, all of these pivoting moves have secondary effects. Baton Pass passes stat boosts, which is why it's banned, so I won't be mentioning it again in this video. U-turn is a physical 70 base power bug move, Chilly Reception sets snow, Flip Turn is a physical 60 base power water move, Parting Shot lowers the opponent's attack and special attack by 1 stage, Volt Switch is a 70 base power special electric move, and Teleport has no secondary effect, but it is -6 priority, meaning it will go after every other move except Trick Room. The term pivot has been used loosely over the years, but for the sake of this video, I'm defining a pivot as a Pokemon with a switching move. And as you could probably figure out, a bulky pivot is a Pokemon with solid defenses and a switching move. In this video, I'll be giving examples from SVOU and SSOU, but the ideas I'll discuss can be applied to many generations and formats. For SVOU, some common examples of bulky pivots would be Flip Turn Alomomola, Chilly Reception Galarian Slowking, U-turn Corviknight, U-turn Moltres, Volt Switch Zapdos, and Parting Shot Pecharunt. Most bulky pivots aren't controversial at all. Almost nobody hates Zapdos, Moltres, or Corviknight. Pecharunt is hated by some, but that has a lot more to do with Poison Puppeteer than its Parting Shot. What people do hate are Galarian Slowking and Alomomola. The reason for this is simple: Regenerator. Regenerator is one of the best abilities in competitive Pokemon, healing 33% of a Pokemon's health when it switches out. Regenerator has single-handedly elevated mediocre Pokemon to top-tier status many times. In Generation 9, some notable Regenerator Pokemon are Tornadus Therian, Toxapex, Hydrapple, and of course, Galarian Slowking, or Glowking, and Alomomola. So what makes people hate Regenerator pivots but not other bulky pivots? The claim is that Regenerator pivots are too easy to use and spam switching moves over and over because they never have to click a recovery move. When Pokemon like Galarian Slowking and Alomomola use pivoting moves, they're so slow that they almost always go last, meaning no matter what your opponent switches into, you'll be in an advantageous spot. No matter which of your opponent's 5 Pokemon they go into, you will be able to respond with something that counters it. It's a checkmate position that many find frustrating. When facing a non-Regenerator pivot, you can at least stay in and attack the bulky pivot as it pivots out, weakening it for next time. But of course, if the Pokemon can just regenerate the damage, this isn't a valid strategy. Many have called Galarian Slowking and Alomomola broken for this reason. In Generation 8, Teleport Slowbro, another bulky slow Regenerator pivot, faced calls to be banned as well. Although these bans never occurred, in fact there wasn't even a suspect test, dislike of these pivots hasn't faded. By now you're probably thinking that these Regenerator pivots sound pretty toxic, and if so, I get it. But I'm going to make a different argument in this video. I believe that bulky pivots, in particular Regenerator pivots, are fantastic for metagame health, and Pokemon like Alomomola and Glowking make the tiers they're in more diverse and competitive. I've broken my argument up into 3 main points. But before we get into that, please remember to subscribe, like, and leave a comment if you're enjoying the video. If you don't subscribe, I will hack into Pokemon Showdown and make all of your opponent's Pokemon get 66% health restored from Regenerator. Now, let's get right into it. Number 1. These Pokemon improve balance. Hyper Offense teams hardly ever switch, and thus almost never utilize bulky pivots. Stall teams sometimes utilize bulky pivots, and Stall does love Regenerator, but Stall mostly has no problem switching between walls. Bulky pivots are best utilized by teams in the middle range, including Semi-Stall, Offense, and Balance. Before I continue, if you don't know what I'm talking about, I'll link a video in the description that explains what these team archetypes are. So, pivots are most helpful for balanced teams, and least helpful for Stall and Hyper Offense teams. It can then be concluded that the presence of Regenerator bulky pivots will strengthen these middle archetypes. Hyper-offense teams aren't directly hurt by the presence of Regenerator pivots, but rather just hurt because balance becomes better. Competition between archetypes is a zero-sum game. Stall, though, is directly hurt by the presence of Regenerator pivots. I strongly believe that the best two Pokemon for countering Stall in SVOU are Galarian Slowking and Alomomola, not some breaker like Kyurem or Ogerpon Wellspring. Glowking can pressure Stall with Future Sight, but most importantly, it allows you to safely transition between Pokemon. Alomomola does this as well, while also healing Pokemon with Wish, which is something very easy to do against passive Stall teams. Now, Stall does sometimes utilize Glowking and Alomomola, but if you think that means Stall is happy with their presence, you're dead wrong. Stall would become way better if Alomomola and Glowking were banned. Is it a good thing that Regenerator pivots make Stall and Hyper Offense worse, though? Some say the ideal metagame is one where all archetypes are near equally viable, but I disagree. Hyper Offense and Stall are much more matchup reliant than other archetypes. If your opponent can't break past your Stall core, then you can win without playing well or thinking very hard. Similarly, if you have a sweeper or a combination of sweepers that your opponent just can't answer, you can win without playing well or thinking much at all. Teams in the balanced range, meaning semi-Stall to offense, are much less likely to heavily depend on matchup. I believe that Hyper Offense and Stall teams lead to less competitive games than the other archetypes, so a metagame that favors these archetypes is probably less competitive than a metagame that favors balance. On top of that, balance is typically the most diverse archetype, so a metagame where balance is strong is likely going to be a more diverse metagame. For these reasons, I believe that the ideal metagame is one that favors balanced playstyles, while the extremes are viable, but not as good. Bulky Regenerator pivots push the metagame toward a balance-favored state. Number 2. Bulky pivots enable low tiers. In particular, bulky Regenerator pivots are a godsend to a lot of low-tier Pokemon. Many things can make a Pokemon bad, but one of the most common is having poor defensive typing or poor defensive stats. Even if a Pokemon is extremely offensively threatening, if it dies to a light breeze, it won't be used. Pivots like Glowking and Alomomola fix this problem. Consider a Pokemon like Lokix. It has the defensively horrendous type of Bug and Dark, with a 71 base HP, 78 defense, and 55 special defense. Without bulky pivots, this Pokemon would absolutely never have a chance in OU. And yet Lokix has great results in tournaments, thanks to being paired with Alomomola, a bulky pivot with Regenerator that brings it in safely. Alomomola can take an attack, get the slow flip turn out, regen off the damage, and bring in Lokix for a massive Tinted Lens first impression, knockoff, or U-turn. I recently got into a top 5 spot on the OU ladder with Choice Band Talonflame. Talonflame worked surprisingly well, but given how frail it is, it wouldn't have been able to enter the field without the flip turn offered by Alomomola. Weavile is another example of this. It's commonly paired with Pecharunt and Galarian Slowking. Poor defenses might have kept Weavile from seeing significant usage in OU otherwise, but bulky pivots came to the rescue. In Generation 8, I built many teams using low-tier Pokemon that could not have worked without bulky pivots. Porygon Z, Regieleki, Nihilego, and Arctozolt all managed to hit rank 1 on the OU ladder, thanks to Teleport Slowbro with Regenerator. Without the safe and reliable entry opportunities offered by Slowbro, these defensively frail Pokemon certainly wouldn't be able to function. You might argue, why do these Pokemon have to be Regenerator pivots? Couldn't normal pivots like Moltres, Zapdos, and Corviknight bring in low tiers and frail Pokemon as well? Well, the answer is yes, but not nearly as well. As I explained earlier, Pokemon like Moltres, Zapdos, Corviknight, and all other bulky pivots that lack Regenerator often have to decide between clicking a switching move or clicking a recovery move. That means you rely on these Pokemon less for pivoting. And if you can't count on a Pokemon pivoting very often, you'll want to make sure that as many Pokemon as possible on your team are bulky enough to switch in on their own if needed. and so you can say goodbye to low kicks and Porygon Z. All Regenerator pivots help frail low tiers, but Alomomola in particular is great for supporting common defensive low tiers as well, thanks to Wish. Wish is a move that recovers 50% health the turn after it's used, but that 50% is based on the health of the Pokemon that used it, meaning Alomomola's incredible 165 base HP allows it to heal other Pokemon a lot more than 50% with just one Wish. Lack of reliable recovery is another reason Pokemon end up in the lower tiers, and Alomomola is the best Wish passer in all of competitive Pokemon. Without Alomomola's presence, Pokemon like Hoopa Unbound, Galarian Weezing, and Hisuian Goodra would have significantly less usage. Number 3. Regenerator pivots just aren't that broken. There's plenty of counterplay to regen pivots. It's a great ability, but people often overestimate the potency of Glowking and Alomomola. First of all, these pivots really aren't helpful against Hyper Offense teams, which never really switch anyway. But assuming you're not playing Hyper Offense, there's still tons of counterplay. Hazard Chip is one great way to wear down these walls. Now, they often run heavy-duty boots, but Alomomola isn't too difficult to knock off. Glowking is harder, but the threat of knockoff can make it easier to handle, and of course, if it's not running heavy-duty boots, it will suffer to hazards as well. Regenerator can also be overpowered fairly easily. 33% is great, but most of the time Alomomola and Glowking are switching into a threat then slow pivoting out. That means they're taking 2 attacks. Almost anything can do a lot more than 33% with 2 attacks, so progress will be made. There are other things you can do with these 2 turns as well. You can set up stat boosts with a sweeper, get up hazards, remove hazards. Slow pivoting is great, but 2 turns is a lot of room to give your opponent. Furthermore, if you know you're going to get flip turned or chilly receptioned, even if your opponent will always get the switch advantage, you can basically decide what they'll switch into. Whatever you bring in will force your opponent into certain options, and you can choose to force their hand into whatever is easiest for your team to deal with. Let's look at an example to make this more clear. In this game, I led with Great Tusk as my opponent led with Landorus. Landorus gets up rocks, I decide to go for an Ice Spinner, and the Landorus goes for Earth Power as I decide to Ice Spinner and finish off the Landorus. Then in comes Kyurem. I've got an Assault Vest Hatterene, so I switch into that, take an Earth Power without too much of a problem, and to make a middle ground, I cover Glowking with a Nuzzle. Now, at this point, I'm reasonably certain I'm going to be chilly receptioned on. So I ask myself, what's the easiest Pokemon for me to deal with? Well, if Kyurem comes in again, that would be pretty rough here. I really don't want that to enter, because my team really struggles with that, and Hatterene is not enjoying hazards and being chipped. It probably would die to an Earth Power plus an Ice move switching in again. If I leave Hatterene in, that gives my opponent a pretty easy opportunity to go into Kingambit, which isn't great either. So what is easy for me to deal with? Well, that would be Cinderace. I've got an eject button Alomomola that can switch in on anything Cinderace wants to do, and that'll allow me to eject into my Raging Bolt, which is Choice Scarf. So here, knowing this Glowking will chilly reception, I go into Scizor. Sure enough, there it comes, and of course, my opponent goes into Cinderace. They would never chilly into Ival, which hates Scizor, Kingambit dies to a CC, and of course, Kyurem is terrible against Scizor. So, naturally, the Cinderace comes in. Now, even though my opponent, you could say, got the play right by not clicking Pyro Ball, it doesn't matter because the eject button is going to eliminate that U-turn. I go into Raging Bolt and surprise the Cinderace and get a KO with Draco Meteor. So, there's plenty of counterplay to Regenerator pivots. Hazard Chip, pressuring with knockoff, attacking to wear down health for next time, and minimizing harm by switching and forcing your opponent's hand. There's something all of these solutions have in common though. They involve long-term thinking. Chipping down a regen pivot or setting hazards to pressure them with knockoff, or attacking a pivot so it won't be able to safely enter the field next time, or switching out to minimize devastation caused by the free switch. All of these things involve thinking many turns ahead. This is something a lot of players struggle with, particularly less experienced players. Much of the hate for regen pivots like Alamomola comes from lower level players. There's no simple answer to the regen pivot, and it takes experience to know whether you should attack the pivot just to chip it, or switch out to minimize damage or do something else. It's a complicated situation. So to put it simply, if you think Regenerator pivots are broken, it's probably because you're not playing the situation correctly. Now, hating regen pivots and bulky pivots in general is of course fair, and everybody has their personal preference. But before you decide to hate them, ask yourself this: do you like diverse metagames? Do you like lots of low tiers being viable in OU? Do you like metagames where balance and offense are strong and extremes like stall and hyper offense are weaker? If you answered yes to these questions, then you should love bulky pivots as much as I do. Let me know if you agree or disagree in the comments and tell me why. I'll do my best to respond to every comment. Hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time.